Actual Fluency Podcast, episode 36 with Alex Rawlings.
Welcome to the Actual Fluency Podcast, the podcast that gives you the tools and inspiration to learn languages faster and more efficiently. And now your host, Chris Broholm.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast. I'm here once again bringing you the best interviews with language learners across the world. And we're here to learn how to learn languages, but also get inspired and motivated to work even harder on our own language learning. And if you've visited actualfluency.com recently, you're going to notice a bit of let's call it a makeover. The old website was very old-fashioned and it was not very good. So I decided to do a bit of a splash and upgrade the design of the website. So if you want to check that out and give me some feedback, that would be awesome. And if you find any, bugs or problems, I'd like to know as well. I'm sure some might appear now that it's in a kind of a new phase. But today I've got a real treat for you. The guest who I'm bringing on today is Mr. Alex Rawlings. And Alex is one of the heavy hitters of polyglots. And he is one of the persons that I originally wanted to have on the show when I first thought of the show, about 7 months ago. So he was a high priority for me. And sadly, as it always is with the people who are incredibly interesting, they're also usually incredibly busy. That's why it's taking me 37 weeks to get Alex Rawlings on the show, but he is on the show today, and I'm really excited because we had a great talk about learning languages, and we also got into learning some Russian, and he's talking a little bit about what he's struggling with right now in terms of Hungarian. He recently moved to Budapest, and he's trying to learn the language there, and I'm sure he'll be successful. He's learned 11, 12 other languages, so there's no reason this shouldn't succeed either. But thank you so much for listening to the podcast. It means a lot to me, and I hope you enjoyed this episode with Mr. Alex Rawlings. And if you are listening to this via iTunes, I would really appreciate if you took the time to leave a little review or comment or anything you might have the time for. If you're not on iTunes, you can find this podcast by going to actualfluency.com and then putting in /iTunes, and it will redirect you to the iTunes store where you can check out the podcast, and you are invited to leave a review or rating or whatever they call it these days. I really appreciate it. And it takes an Apple account or something. So, that's why I understand that not all of you are able to do it. It's kind of a hassle. I think it should be easier to evaluate people's podcasts. But anyway, I hope you enjoy the interview today with Alex Rawlings, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, everybody. Today I have a real treat for you as I'm joined by Mr. Alex Rawlings. Alex was in 2012 named the most multilingual student in Britain, speaking over 10 languages, which landed him appearances in mainstream media such as the BBC, the big BBC. Alex, awesome you could be here today. And how is life?
Hi, Chris. Life is good. I'm in Budapest, which is a wonderful city and very different to the UK.
Fantastic. And of course, Alex, a lot of people know you know that. But for those people who may not have heard of you yet, can you give a little backstory to yourself? How on earth did you get started learning all these languages?
Sure. So it started off as a kind of obscure hobby. To just learn languages. I was always kind of very aware that languages were around because my mother is Greek. My father lived in Japan for 4 years. So I knew what languages were. I knew they existed and I knew they were important. Mm-hmm. When I got to about 14, I decided to start learning them more seriously. It just kind of happened out of interest after a trip to Holland, where I heard Dutch and thought, wow, that sounds really funny. So I'm going to learn it. And then from there, I went on to learn more languages because I knew that it wasn't as hard as people might make out, as in you could do it if you really try. And then I ended up doing a degree in modern languages, and now I'm teaching 4 different languages here in Budapest. So languages quickly became my life.
Wow. Incredible. And you, when you look back, you just kind of imagine yourself in the Netherlands going, that sounds really exciting, and that kind of sparked something in you, or did?
It was literally the exact moment when we were sitting on the plane waiting to go, and they played the security announcement in Dutch, and I was like, "Whoa, what is that?"
Yeah, I had the same experience. I think the first time I heard Dutch. It's a good language, and of course you speak it very well now, so you could do the demo if you wanted to.
I'm not quite trained to become an EasyJet cabin crew member in Dutch. No, not yet. That's a future resolution.
But they need to make a bigger name tag then to fit all the flags. That's a problem. Anyway, so how did you first study the languages? When you were 14 years old, you didn't know anything. You know, well, of course, we all know when we're 14 we know everything, but about languages you had no idea. So how did you go about? You said you want to learn Dutch. How did you do it, actually?
I just followed one of the courses, you know, and the course got me so far. I think it was the Teach Yourself Dutch course, which I really liked, actually, because there was lots of variety and it was very practical applications of vocabulary. When I ran out of things that the course could teach me, as in when the course got stale for me, I moved on to just using more realistic resources, like finding news articles, watching films, listening to the radio a lot, writing down words I don't know, looking them up in the dictionary, and of course, you know, eventually moving on to reading some books.
So that sounds kind of natural as well.
Yeah, and I mean, this was quite a long process, you know. I mean, had no desire to learn Dutch very quickly. Back when I was 14, I thought I would want to go and live in Holland. So I was like, okay, cool, I've got time to learn this. So it just happened, and it was a very kind of comfortable hobby that I really enjoyed doing it. And because I enjoyed it so much, I managed to, you know, get to quite a good level.
Great. And also this natural approach is something that, you know, I've heard you talk about before. And the question I had about natural approach and is related to vocabulary, because, you know, if I have a book in Russian, say I have a graded Russian book, it's a 1,000-word vocabulary requirement, or not a requirement, but that's what they estimate. How would it be natural for me when I read through the book and I realize I don't understand the gist of this text? You know, I don't understand enough. Then I go back and find, let's say, a kid's book or something. But how do I then make the bridge from, okay, I know 5 Russian words or 50 or 100 of the first some of them, to actually getting to the stage where I can do the natural kind of, you know, immersion when I can pick up Dostoevsky or Pushkin or whatever. How do you bridge that gap naturally? How do you bridge that gap naturally?
How do you bridge that gap? Well, Russian is a very particular case because the literary language of Russian is so different to what you're learning normally, you know? And even now, I still struggle a bit with writers like Dostoevsky, simply because the language that they use is so far removed from the language spoken in Russia today.
Right.
The way I bridged that gap is I didn't start reading novels first in Russian. I didn't read literature. I started reading factual stuff, newspaper articles. Okay, because that language is it's much more obvious, the meaning of it, when you're still kind of like an upper intermediate stage. And then from there, once you're used to just sitting down and reading information in Russian and extracting meaning, and you develop that reading competence, you can move on to the more difficult literary stuff, if that makes sense. But I mean, I also just want to talk about what I mean by this natural method.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I'm not sure that we're totally on the same page about it. So I don't mean you read a book and you learn the vocabulary from reading the book. What I mean about the natural idea is that you use natural sources to access vocabulary. Okay, so you read a book, you're like, I don't know this word, I don't know this word, I don't know this word. I go and I look them up and I learn them. Okay, but the natural part of it is that you read it in a context and for a purpose, which is to extract meaning. The opposite of this approach would be to sit down with a vocabulary list, for example, and sit down and learn them, because that for me is very ineffective learning, because it means I have isolated vocabulary items in my mind, which I then can't use in sentences because I've never seen them in a sentence before.
Right. That makes it hard to remember as well.
Absolutely. And it's very unsatisfying for me because I can't use them. basically. And that's the whole point of language, right? We want to be able to speak and communicate, not just to develop a memory vault.
Of course. And so how do you, in practice, let's take an example like Hungarian, which you've been studying for some time. How do you then do when you go to your book or your newspaper, or whatever natural source you pick your vocabulary from, do you then plot words into your own memorized course, for instance, or do you find a course that already exists? What do you do in practice?
Well, Hungarian I'm definitely not at a level in Hungarian yet where I can just read. That's just not happened yet. So I'm still learning very intensely with a grammar course. Now, I like this grammar course because it explains all the grammar very clearly, but the vocabulary aspect of it is, very abstract. For example, decline the verb, conjugate the verb to be settled, in 3 different tenses.
Right.
So I'm on the one hand, I'm like, cool, okay, the point is not the vocabulary. We're just trying to learn how to do these tenses. But on the other hand, I'm thinking, hang on a minute, this is a really good opportunity to actually learn this word and to improve my vocabulary. So before I actually do the exercise that it's asking me to do, I take these words and I invent a sentence. For example, I'm settling down in Hungary is the sentence that I have. And then I write it out with that sentence for each of the declinations, just so there's, the conjugations, just so there's a context, just so there's meaning, which helps to make it more memorable for me. And that's how I can learn those words.
Right. And then is that enough for you because obviously creating a sentence is a lot of kind of mental energy and it's a lot of focus on that word in the sentence, or do you throw it into like a spaced repetition system? Or is that not necessary for you usually?
I don't really do the spaced repetition stuff. For me, honestly, the focus is on the communication.
Right.
So I can't learn words unless they're conveying meaning. And yeah, you're right. It's more mental strain to kind of invent a sentence in which you would use this word, but it pays off in the longer term because your ultimate goal is to use this word in a sentence. Yeah. So practicing, for example, I'm settling down in Hungary. I'm thinking, Magyarország on, because it's, a Hungarian city. So we have to use that suffix instead of another one. And also it's something I can imagine myself telling people, when they say, oh, why are you in Hungary? I said, oh, I'm settling down in Hungary.
Right. Yeah, I find that great. I guess the only struggle I'm having is that I imagine you having a big ledger or like a book or something. You didn't sit down and write out your sentences and then go over them sometimes after, or is revision not even necessary? It just gets lodged in your memory because you work so hard on it.
I think revision is always necessary, but there are things you can do to make it less necessary, if you know what I mean. And this is one thing that I find that makes learning vocabulary like this more memorable, so that I don't have to sit down every morning and kind of go like, right, what did I learn? I can maybe do it every week.
Right. So simply just using it in practice and trying to develop natural sentences that you could see yourself using and encountering.
Absolutely. I think we all have different goals when we learn languages. We all learn them from different purposes. Some people have absolutely no desire to be able to speak them. Some people just want to be able to read them, for example, for academic purposes or just, out of interest or just to understand TV shows, whatever. But once you work out what that goal is, every stage of the language learning journey has to be orientated towards that.
Right,
okay. Right. So for me, I need to use Hungarian. I live here. I need to be able to speak it. So everything that I learn has to have that in mind.
Right. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I find this kind of aspect. And of course, when you do the sentences in the sentence form, you will also develop the grammar knowledge because you can always refer to an example instead of just a rule.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can kind of extrapolate directly from your working knowledge instead of having to say, I don't know, in German you might say, well, auf is controls both dative and accusative, and therefore you need to know that. But instead, if you just had a sentence, then you could refer to it much more clearly in your mind. That's correctly understood? Absolutely.
I mean, like another example, for example, is Russian verbs of motion. The big sticking point for learners of Russian. If you just learn them in a sentence, if you give them a context, you understand when you would use them, they stick.
Right.
That's how I learned them. Okay, I spent ages poring over descriptive grammatical analyses of when you use khadil, when you use bashol, when you use shol. None of it stuck. But someone said to me, I remember actually my friend lost his phone, and he said, "Oh no, I've lost my phone. Завтра я схожу. Tomorrow I will go to the shop and come back." And I was like, okay.
Right. And so every time you think of the verb for that, you would think about your friend losing your phone.
Yeah, it's stuck in my head like this. Fun. Yeah. And when we talk about, I've been to Egypt, for example, you would say ездил. Yeah, ездил в Египет. And I remember very clearly one of my teachers talking about this time she went to Egypt, and she said, я ездила в Египет, And all this kind of exposure, all this kind of real contextualizing of these quite complex grammatical forms has meant that I don't forget them now, and I remember them,
right.
And I use them very naturally.
Yeah, and Russian is I find Russian very beautiful in the sense that, well, not only that you can describe exactly how you're doing it and if you're coming back or not, that's very nice, but also all the kind of the suffixes and prefixes, I find that that's also very beautiful, but it also creates confusion when you're just doing the word list, because it's like nachadid, uchadid, vuichadid, they all sound so similar that if you don't have a reference point, you might be stumped to actually tell them apart.
Yeah. No, well, this is where the reference point is really important. And when I was learning this list of verbs that, with the prefixes like you're describing, uchadid, vuichadid, schadid, etc., on a piece of paper next to each other, they all look identical. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the meaning couldn't be further apart. Right. So the moment you inject context into that vocabulary list, you don't get them confused. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, for example, you think vuichadid, uchadid. Yeah, the difference is to go outside and to leave. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll go outside for a few minutes. Я выйду на минуту, and я ухожу навсегда. I'm going away forever. Yeah. So there's quite different meanings, even though we're talking about maybe one or two letters difference.
Exactly. And that's very, I find that very appealing for the language as well. That's one of the things I'm enjoying.
Wonderful. And Hungarian has it as well, as I'm discovering, which is very exciting.
Oh, yeah. Can you use any of your Russian, the knowledge of the Russian verbs to do better in Hungarian?
There's a few grammar points I've come across so far in Hungarian that are familiar because of Russian. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, this is a very controversial issue, whether or not Hungarian is related to Slavic languages. One theory is that the Hungarian people, of course, they came from the Ural Mountains. Yeah, before they came to Hungary. So they used to live in what is now Russia, and there was some kind of contact between Russian and Hungarian people before they came to Hungary. But anyway, I mean, so I've noticed that, for example, there are two different ways of saying in Hungarian, like there are in Russian. In Russian, you'd say v, which means in, and na, which means on. Mm-hmm. Exactly the same thing exists in Hungarian, and it's kind of similar when you'd use each case. There's also a similar way of expressing possession. У меня есть, у меня нет, van nekem, nincs nekem, and things like that. Mm-hmm. And also this thing with prefixes on verbs, to go in, bemeni, instead of just meni, which is to go. So little things that are helping me along, which I learn and I think, that seems familiar.
Right. And speaking of Russian, of course, I always find that interesting because, I mean, it's the language that I'm learning at the moment. Mm-hmm. And I never miss an opportunity to ask into that language. But one thing I noticed you said in one of your interviews was that, I mean, you lived in Yaroslavl for quite a while, and you said, I couldn't find the video directly, but paraphrase, you said something like, to truly learn Russian, you need to live there. And I wanted to ask you whether that's unique for Russian, first of all. And and exactly what is meant by really learn, does that mean that if I never go to Russia, I'll never be able to sort of be a high intermediate or advanced level?
So we say things and we change our minds.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, that's what.
But having said that, I still haven't met anyone who speaks really good Russian who hasn't spent time there.
Right.
So what we're talking about here is we're talking about the authenticity. And this is just true for some languages. There are some languages that you can't achieve an authentic level in unless you have immersion, because you just cannot get the materials that you can for, say, English or German or French anywhere in the world. Russian is a very dynamic language. Things are changing in Russian all the time. And, as we've been talking about so far, the way that I really managed to learn the grammar was through the context. And my context was being in Russian and surrounded by loads of situations where Russian people were using the language. Yeah. Right. So that's how I learned it. That's how I made everything stick. And still now when I speak Russian, I have this real associative memory, and in my mind, I'm back in Russia and I can see it all, and I can see the places where I learned these things. I can see the places where I first used these words. So for me, I don't think my Russian would be as good as it is now without having been to Russia as much as I have.
Right.
But, I wouldn't say that shouldn't put you off. I'd say it's more something to kind of aim for, that, I'm going to save up, learn language and go and spend a few weeks over there and see the difference that it will make.
Right. And how's that different from the time that the video was recorded?
Because I think since saying that, I think I have met people who have never been to the target country and yet have pretty good knowledge of the language. Not necessarily for Russian, but with other languages, definitely.
Is this pronunciation, or is it just a lexicon?
I've also changed my mind about pronunciation. I mean, it's mainly pronunciation is very noticeable if you haven't spent time in Russia,
right?
Simply because it's more than just how you pronounce the words. It's the intonation, it's the flair of language, all these kind of things, which is an everyday occurrence in Russia, but that you cannot access really when you're outside.
Right.
Pronunciation, I think it's less important than I used to think it was. I think it doesn't matter if you sound foreign anymore. Right. But vocabulary, I think you can learn vocabulary outside of the target country. I think you can do it. It's much harder, but you can.
Right.
Also, of course, in saying that, I've now moved to Hungary and I'm experiencing for myself just how difficult it is to learn a language while being in the country.
Right. And is that because you need to kind of integrate really well into the community, or what kind of trouble or struggles are you finding?
The struggle is you have to get up every day and go to work and come home, and when do you learn the language? I talked about this a little bit in Novi Sad, I mean, since arriving in Hungary, I've just been working and going to and from IKEA to take stuff back that I bought wrong, so when can I really sit down and do it? And I think this is a problem that a lot of expats struggle with.
Right.
So I'm quite excited that I've had this problem because it's been quite eye-opening, and I'm now working on ways that I can fix it and that I can try and get around it.
Right. And because you are in the country, so obviously, it doesn't make much sense to book a italki lesson or something,
Well, that's what I've done.
Yeah.
I found a very good looking Hungarian teacher that will help me, and we'll see how they go. I think I just need the structure. Because my timetable now is very, very tight, much more than it used to be. So I just need to put aside an hour, 2 hours a week in which, I learn Hungarian.
Right. And using the aforementioned methods. And
yeah, I mean, the teacher seemed very happy to work with me in the ways that I specified. So we'll see how it goes. But I mean, you say you're in the country, so you don't need a teacher. But this is another big problem, which has kind of hit me in the face.
Right.
When you're in an immersed environment with a very low level of the language, it's very demotivating to kind of be faced with how little of the language you actually can speak.
Right.
And for almost every language interaction that you have to be negative because you can't make yourself understood, you don't understand something, or they switch to English.
Right.
This is actually kind of a big problem when you're moving to a new country and you're trying to learn the language, and it's very off-putting. And I think it takes a lot of strength to kind of get through this and reach an intermediate level of fluency.
Yeah, I haven't tried it yet, but I get that from a lot of people have told me that. And the interesting thing is when I tell people outside the language learning community that I want to learn, for instance, Chinese next year or the year after, they say, "Oh, so when are you moving?" I mean, it's not. Those two things are definitely not connected, and they are twice not connected, because they're not connected in the sense that you don't automatically learn the language when you move there, which is what
Absolutely.
you just talked about, and a lot of other people have experienced, like Benny Lewis also talked about it at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is you can actually learn the language outside of the country. You don't have to go
Absolutely.
to China or Russia. I mean, it helps, of course. I mean, it can help, actually, is I guess the correct phrase. I mean, it doesn't have to. It might impede you because you, like you said, you encounter ton of stumbling blocks.
Yeah.
Or you think, oh, well, I'm in the country, so I'm obviously learning the language. I don't need to study at home.
That's exactly what's happening right now for me in Hungarian, because like the vast majority of the Hungarian knowledge that I've got now, I learned in July at home before I came here.
Right.
Yeah. And then since coming here, I'm like, oh, well, I had Hungarian all day today. I don't need to study any. Whereas if I'd been back in the UK, I would have thought, right, I need to do some Hungarian because otherwise I'm going to forget it all.
Exactly.
You get complacent as well about having it all around you.
Right. So everything else being equal, you would actually learn more Hungarian if you were in England right now.
I think if I was in England, I would have raced through the beginning stages with much more enthusiasm than I am now. I feel like I'm stuck between A1 and A2,
right.
And it's very frustrating.
Yeah, I definitely relate.
And I think the ideal point to arrive in an immersed environment is when you're just starting on B1.
Right. That beginning conversational awareness.
When you've got the basis and it can only go up from there.
Right. The moment when you don't have to switch to another language to explain what you're actually trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah, you can get by at B1 with whatever you've got.
Right.
Even if it doesn't sound like amazing, you can get by, and that's the really exciting point. The really exciting point to be with learning a new language.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just had that experience with German. I think it's hard to assess, but I did one of those UNDAF tests.
Oh yeah,
which is just A1 to C2 tests to see where you are, and it's actually quite difficult. I found.
Yeah, it's very
difficult. You have to put in words, like they give you some sentences and there are empty spaces. And German has a lot of like curious, I would say, words that are used, for instance, to start subclauses or, to start sentences. So I was like really stumped by it. And it was like the first week of my German education is a placement test, right? So I scored as B1, which was... after 8 years of studying in school, I thought it was a little bit low, but then I thought, I'm probably right where I should be.
Yeah.
And I went to Kiel for a week, and I just spoke German all week. And did I make millions of mistakes? Yes. Did I say the wrong article every single word? Probably, because I didn't learn articles back in primary school. But did I have to switch to English? No. And that's really, really great. And I just wanted to underline that point that you said with a personal story, because I told my German kind of he lent his house out to the people from our school, and I just told him that it's so amazing to actually be able to speak a language. And I apologized to him every day for butchering it so hard, but it was I was speaking it all the time, so.
You know what? I mean, I'm a native English speaker, so I'm long given up apologizing for butchering other people's languages when, the things I hear done to English every day. I just think like, okay, let's get over it.
We're even, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
keep a list. No, I think I understand that. And, I don't think he wasn't taking offense or anything, but obviously because he was giving me, a bedroom, then I was in contact with him a lot. So yeah, I felt I had to say something to him. That's great. And can you? We talked about a little bit of learning independently versus learning not independently, but learning in your home country, in your home, in an easy, stress-free environment.
Sure.
How do you think? What kind of sacrifices did you have to make back when you were, you had this learning environment where you could just kind of go nuts and study all day if you wanted to? Did you feel like you were sacrificing anything? I mean,
No, I never felt like I was sacrificing anything. And I think it's because when I was actually studying more than I am now, I was very in control of it, and it was very efficient. So I'm never the kind of person who sits down and studies all day, because I find that to be inefficient.
Right.
I think an hour max is what you want to do, and you split that up between the morning, the afternoon, and the evening.
Right.
Okay, so my ideal formula for this, which worked for a really long time, and if I had a bit more time now, I would be doing it still. 15 minutes in the morning where you review what you did the day before. Half an hour in the middle of the day where you cover the new material. 15 minutes in the evening where you review that material one more time.
Right.
Every day, that's an hour, and that is so efficient. Yeah, because it gives your brain time for everything to sink in. It filters out the things that are in your long-term memory and your short-term memory. And then when you go back to it in the evening, you just like redo it all again. You sleep on it. Then the next morning you do it again. And it's there.
Right.
It's
that. I mean, maybe that should be a book. The Rawlings method.
Yeah, well, that's the method. So it's going to be a very short book.
Do a very quick book.
Yeah.
Leaflet.
So, I mean, that's not a big sacrifice.
No, not at all.
Yeah. Let's say you get up at 7, you have breakfast by 7:30, 7:30, 7:45, you're doing a bit of language, then you get on with your day.
Yeah, that's no problem. I think anyone could do that. All right, actually, I believe everyone could do that, yeah.
Absolutely, they absolutely could. What about your lunch break? Let's say that's half an hour. Just use that to learn some languages while you're eating your sandwich.
Yeah.
And in the evening when you get home, a quick 15 minutes. I mean, I'm giving this advice. I should really follow my own advice. I'm going to start on Monday.
Well, I mean, that can be motivating as well, right? To pass on the information and then know by yourself that you have to follow it. Well, you just have to, but...
Okay, this is my resolution. As of Monday, I'm going back to this.
All right, well, I'll keep you to it for sure. And of course, you went to Oxford, which I'm sure a lot of people would like to, but obviously not everyone can do that. And one thing I was fascinated about when you mentioned it was that they seem to have a different approach. And I don't know if this approach is for just language learning or if it's a kind of a university-wide approach. But every time I hear people when they're studying languages in university, they're like, yeah, it's all right, but I'm doing the most at home. And they don't feel like, they feel like they could have done it alone. They don't need the university. They're just kind of there because they're interested and they get the degree. But from you, it sounded as though the university was very good at encouraging good language learning methods and kind of motivate you to be these good independent language learners. Is that the experience you had at Oxford, or?
I think it depends. I mean, I talked about this a lot in Berlin in my talk there, which is available on YouTube. The thing is with Oxford is that it just assumed that you would develop these language skills. So again, the onus was very much on you to make sure that you actually do. But the focus of the degree was not on learning languages as much as studying literature and linguistics. With translation. Translation was about 50%, and the translation was the only real point where we actually were dealing with language. But I think that the idea behind all of this was that by reading materials in the target language, so reading literature, reading linguistics, you would develop over the course of 4 years a good enough vocabulary and command of the language to be able to translate very complex text at the end. And I think that is what happens.
Right.
But it's hard work.
Well, I mean, you're getting your money's worth, maybe, in terms of getting something for it. But that's, I think education is very fascinating, and it always saddens me when, let's say, high schools or that elementary schools are, not really encouraging people to learn languages. So, I'm glad that the most people I've heard from universities have been quite positive, but obviously you don't learn a language in a semester or even a few semesters unless you put the work in. But you believe that it's not a race, obviously we know that, but you believe that less is more in kind of way. Is that a way to put it?
Yeah, I just think I think when you're learning languages, you can waste a lot of time doing stuff which is inefficient. And that's very frustrating because we don't have very much time.
No.
No one has much time. So
right.
You have to maximize the time that we do have to see what we can achieve, in our lives.
Right. But you've learned so many languages that there also has to be another concern of maintenance, right? Or is that not?
Yeah, this is a big concern, and this is kind of a question where I falter a little bit when people ask them to me, because the truth is that I'm lazy about maintaining languages, more so than I should be. I don't have any problem personally with allowing languages to go a bit rusty,
right? Because
I know that I'm not forgetting them. They're just going to the back of my head. And, with not much effort, I can bring them back to where they were and take them further. That's been my experience with all the languages I've learned. So, for example, I stopped formally studying French 8 years ago. And I haven't really studied much since at all. That means that my spoken French is weak. but my understanding of French is still very strong. And on the occasions in those 8 years when I've been in a French immersed speaking environment, it's taken maybe a few days to adjust, but then I've been back to being confident with speaking, and I can reactivate all the stuff that's there.
Right.
And that's basically how I maintain the languages. It's on a very much like a needs basis. Do I need to speak French right now? Not really. I need to speak other languages, so let's work on them, and we'll come to French when we need to.
Right. And what kind of level? I mean, obviously, if you only studied the language for a week and you don't study it for years, then obviously you probably lose everything mostly. But what kind of level do you need to? Is that this B1, or do you need to be slightly higher before you can kind of just set it and forget it? Not literally, of course, but
yeah, when you put it like that, it sounds quite bad. I think a steady intermediate level is what's needed for long-term learning.
Right.
Basically, I mean, yeah, that's not having finished learning a language. When we finish learning a language, we're at C2.
Right.
There's no question about that. But there are points at which you can take breaks. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, another thing that I'm trying, when I arrived in Hungary, and I couldn't speak very much Hungarian at all, the language which kept coming out my mouth was Hebrew. Uh-huh. And I have no idea why. Just all the time I was responding to people in Hebrew, and I was like, what's going on? And I was thinking, oh my God, this is really bad. I'm confusing Hungarian with Hebrew. How is this happening? But then I've decided to just embrace this. And I'm going to be continuing my Hebrew studies as well as my Hungarian at the same time. Oh. So what this has taught me is that you can learn languages up to, say, B1, take a break, then maybe a few years later, come back, take them up to C1. And that's now what I'd like to do with Hebrew. You forget things, but you remember them much more quickly. It's not like you're having to learn them all over again, because you've learned them once. They're somewhere in your brain, right. And there are theories that say that we never forget anything that we learn in our lives. Wow. Yeah, we have to remember them.
That's a very interesting theory, particularly with language learning, of course.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I found that to be true.
Yeah.
And when I come across words that I don't recognize at first, it's not, oh, what does that mean? It's, oh, yeah, no, I remember. I learned this.
Right. That's really cool. Even if you don't remember the meaning, you remember that at some point you did know what it meant.
Yeah. And now we can move on. That's talking about kind of like subconscious learning, which is something that I have done through listening to music or watching films and not knowing any words.
What's your
just being in some kind of immersion, but not understanding what's going on. And then when you eventually, weeks later, come to learn those words, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. I heard that in that song. I heard that in that film. That sounds familiar. Yeah. And even though you didn't learn it the first time, it wasn't kind of like going into your brain. It's made a start.
Right.
It made a start, which has now made it much easier for you to remember and learn that word.
But is that an efficient way, though? Because a lot of people also question this kind of this passive approach where they say you can't just put on a film in a foreign language and then expect to start to understand anything.
No, it doesn't count as learning.
Right. Oh, okay, good. Okay, so we're on the same page.
This is what you do in addition to your hour a day to embellish what you're learning.
But yeah, I definitely think that I heard there's this Russian group, the Tattoo, that everyone knows. I listened to the songs like when I was very young, and I thought they were quite catchy. And now then when I started studying Russian, I kind of went back to listen to them again. Didn't understand much because obviously lyrics are quite difficult. They use often they sometimes change the grammar a little bit to fit with the rhyme and everything. And they also use maybe some words that you wouldn't use in normal speech just to fit the rhyme. But, whatever. I didn't understand anything. And then slowly, as I was getting more vocabulary and getting more learning, I suddenly remember, I remember that. And, it was kind of, it was starting to make sense. And I just, want to echo that. But I'm glad you said that it's, not study time, because a lot of people get that confused. I've learned that, watching a film, even with subtitles, is not really classified as desk time learning, right?
No, it's not desk time learning. You do your hour a day, you finish, and then you're like, cool, what am I going to do this evening? I'll watch a film. Hey, I know, I'll watch a film in the language that I'm learning with subtitles on.
Right.
Yeah, and that's doing something. It's not as good as sitting down with the books, like we were saying, but it still does something.
Yeah, exactly. It's not it's not a replacement, but it's definitely a nice little addition.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, that's great. That's great. I think a lot of people will take that to heart and start learning using that kind of approach. But Alex, we could talk for years probably about language learning, but sadly the time has run out. But before we part, I just wanted to ask if you had any shout outs. I know you just refreshed your website. It's looking a lot more modern now. Rawlings.com. Wanted to put that in there for you. But any other places where we should check you out?
I'm becoming more and more active on Twitter. I'm blogging for Memrise as well. Posts appear on the Memrise blog either every week or every 2 weeks about everything to do with languages. And yeah, generally, I mean, just watch out. I'm also now a fully qualified language teacher. I'm looking for students and stuff as well. If you'd like to work with me, I'd be very happy to hear from you.
Great. And what's your Memrise username? We want to follow you.
Rawlings.
Excellent. We will follow you and compete with you on the leaderboard.
Right, turn the pressure up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a brilliant feature, isn't it?
Yeah, it gets heated though, like in my final exams, all of the people in my German group, we were doing the same lists.
Oh no.
And it was like, right, get up at 8 a.m. Oh my God, she's been on for 2 hours. Like,
yeah, and it was crazy.
Fun. We all did well in the end.
Yeah, but it's, competition is so good. I've added a lot of people, and some people, I mean, must spend 4 or 5 hours every single day doing it. And it's just like, it blows my mind that they can keep up that kind of work ethic. Yeah. But I mean, I applaud them and I try to keep up, but I also know that it's just not realistic. All right, Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's really awesome. And I hope to see you in Berlin next year. And
absolutely.
All right.
And New York, of course, in October.
New York, I hope so. It's expensive to go across the pond, but if I start saving now, hopefully.
Absolutely.
All right, see you.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you for listening to the Actual Fluency Podcast. For more information, be sure to check out actualfluency.com. Until next time, enjoy learning and have a great day.